state basically made a deal with these private interests, which was twofold. One is, we will protect your monopoly, so we will not let anybody compete against you, and in return, you will allow the state to regulate your rates and what your profits and what you can charge customers. And that worked well for a while. In the 70s, it began to break down, and as a result, many of these networked industries, whether it was railroads or trucking or people like FedEx or the telecom companies, they experienced an enormous revolution in how they operate. And I would argue the electricity sector is, really one of the last dominoes to fall there. So what does rate of return regulation mean, and what are kind of the implications for you guys? It means a couple things, but basically it's called rate of return regulation. It's also called cost of service regulation. Sometimes it's called cost plus regulation. But the basic idea is you try to figure out what does it cost to provide this service. So you add up. In the electric sector, we just had a 2-week-long rate case where we added up all of the things that Excel had done the previous year and wanted to charge the customers for. We figured out what that big pile was, and then went through each one of those items and said, well, is this something the ratepayers should pay for, or is this something the stockholders should eat? That's called a disallowance. So we added up all the capital, the O&M, the taxes. We paid the taxes for the utilities. We built that right into the rates. And then it's all based on what happened last year. So we look at all of those costs over the last year, and then take all of the equity investments that went into it from the stockholders, and then figure out what their rate of return should be and throw that into the pile, and then that becomes the rates. And if the utility sells more electrons in a given year than what they're projecting, they make a huge profit, because every one of those electrons has all of the embedded costs of the of all the capital investments they have plus the rate of return, and it doesn't have to go into anything except for pure profit. But if they sell a little bit of fewer electrons, then they take a really big loss, a disproportionately high loss. So it's an industry where you really want to try to get it right, which is very difficult for through any regulatory regime. There are a couple safeguards. If the utility starts to earn more than their authorized rate of return, the staff of the Public Utilities Commission can file a complaint, and then they pull them in again, the utilities in again, and they reset the rates again. That's called a rate case. And if they under-earn, if the utilities are earning less than they're supposed to earn, then they have a statutory right to come in and say, hey, we're not earning enough money, we need to reset the rates. So in some ways, it's a pretty good deal. They're not going to lose any money. But in other ways, their profits are capped. All of the efficiencies, if there are any, that are created in between rate cases, theoretically flow back to the ratepayer as opposed to the utility. So it has worked well, but I would argue that as a result of this sort of regulation, you end up with a very, very important institution, utilities and the industries that grow up around them, that are very, very risk averse, very conservative, and you end up with regulators who are even more risk averse and more conservative. And I think that's one of the reasons why in the electric power industry we have seen so few innovations. We've not experienced the kind of transformative changes that we've seen in telecom and information services and industries along that. So, I think there are a couple reasons for this. One is you always have somebody looking over your shoulder. If you spend $1, somebody can come to the Public Utilities Commission and say, we don't think they should be able to recover for that. So that becomes an incentive to try to just do what you've always done. The other thing is in the utility world, we tend to average everything. So in Colorado, you spend the same amount for electricity at night as you do in the daytime, even though there's vast differences between the cost of those utilities. So by averaging the costs and socializing the benefits, it also creates an incentive for conservatism or aversion to any kind of risk. Third thing that I think is problematic about this kind of regulation, it's all based on the past. And the assumption that the past is going to be just like the future. And in fact, the future will be a little bit better than the past in that we'll use more electricity, and the average price of that electricity will go down. That's how the whole system can work. And this all leads to kind of a culture within utilities, and I don't think it's the utilities' fault or even the regulators' fault. Maybe it's, the system, but that if it isn't broke, don't fix it. We have this system that works. It's sure. It's all built around the idea that we're going to build the church for Christmas and and have a lot of unused capacity throughout most of the year. But that seems to work, so let's not change it. So that's kind of where we're at. I think what we're facing now, and I think one of the things I think you all know as much as anybody, that this system now is becoming untenable. There are examples of other networks that have radically transformed themselves, and the electric power, I think, is next. And I think there are a couple reasons for this. One is average costs are going up. In some places, use is actually going down, or at least flat, mostly due to government policies, the recession, innovations in efficiency. But cost will become a huge driver to help change this. It's just going to become too expensive to do things the way we have done them. Second is climate change. It's all we're doing is based on burning fossil fuels, which is one of the leading causes of climate change. And then finally, I think there are enough innovators who have looked at other industries, who have looked at this system, and they go, man, this is crazy. There's an easier, better way to do this. We've got to figure out how. So that's a little bit about kind of the system, the regime, the system you're operating in. I want to talk now a little bit about where smart grid fits into this kind of system, and how utilities look at it, and also how regulators look at it. And to some degrees, this could be reassuring. To other degrees, this would be a problem. So the question is, where does the smart grid fit into this scheme? And it really depends. If you're working on something that is will allow for incremental efficiencies to be built into the system and fits in this cost of service model, or even in organized markets, still all the distribution models are regulated. It can, it's something that a utility can embrace easily without any, guilt or problems. If you're thinking of the smart grid as something that is ultimately transformative and it will change the utility model, like the way the internet and wireless communications totally transformed the telecommunications